The harvest season was at its peak in the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England, when the farmhands working near the ancient wolf pits noticed something that would change their understanding of the world forever. Two children emerged from the edge of the forest near the deep trenches where wolves had once been trapped, and every person who saw them stopped their work in stunned silence. The children's skin was bright green, not pale or sickly, but a vivid emerald color that seemed impossible under the harsh midday sun of 12th century England. They wore clothing made from unfamiliar fabric in strange cuts and colors, and they clung to each other while speaking rapidly in a language that sounded like nothing the villagers had ever heard before. The boy and girl looked terrified and disoriented, turning their heads frantically as if searching for something they could not find. One of the older farmhands dropped his scythe and crossed himself, whispering prayers of protection against demons or fairy folk, while the younger men stepped forward cautiously with a mixture of fear and fascination. Where had these green children come from, and what would their impossible story reveal about the hidden corners of medieval England? If you're ready to look beyond the veil of forgotten myths and uncover the secrets the world chose to forget, subscribe to Inside Strange Times, so you won't miss new journeys into the realm of ancient mysteries. The eldest of the farmhands, named John, stepped forward slowly with his hands raised to show he meant no harm, while the green children pressed themselves against each other, and the girl began to cry tears that looked perfectly normal against her emerald skin. John spoke to them in the slow, deliberate English used with foreigners and children, but the boy only shook his head and responded in that strange musical language that rose and fell like nothing anyone in Woolpit had heard before. The village reeve was summoned, and then the bailiff, and finally word was sent to the manor house, where Sir Richard de Calne held authority over Woolpit and the surrounding lands under the rule of King Henry II. By the time Sir Richard arrived on horseback with two of his household knights, half the village had gathered around the strange children who sat in the shade of an oak tree, refusing to move or speak. Sir Richard de Calne dismounted and studied the children with the calculating eye of a man who had seen the world beyond Suffolk, having fought in France and witnessed things that defied easy explanation. He ordered his men to bring water and food, and the villagers watched as bread and cold meat and cheese were laid before the hungry-looking children who recoiled from the offerings as if they were poisoned. The boy touched the bread cautiously and then drew his hand back, speaking urgently to his sister in their incomprehensible tongue, while she shook her head with growing distress. A woman from the village brought fresh milk, still warm from the morning milking, but the children would not drink it despite their obvious thirst and exhaustion. It was the blacksmith's wife, Agnes, who finally discovered what they would accept when she brought out a basket of fresh green beans from her garden, still in their pods. The moment the children saw the beans, their faces transformed with desperate hunger, and they reached for the pods with trembling hands. They tore open the stalks, searching for the beans inside. And when Agnes showed them how to shell the pods properly, they devoured the raw beans with such intensity that it was clear they had not eaten in days. Sir Richard ordered his steward to bring the children to the manor house, where they could be housed and fed and observed until someone could determine where they had come from and what should be done with them. Woolpit, in the year 1150 or thereabouts, was a village of perhaps 300 souls, living in timber and thatch houses clustered around the Church of St. Mary. The land was fertile, and the harvests generally good under the management of Sir Richard, who was known as a fair lord, though not a particularly merciful one. The village took its name from the deep pits at the edge of the forest, where generations earlier wolves had been trapped when they came down from the wilderness to raid the sheep pens. Most villagers had never traveled more than 10 miles from their birthplace, and anything foreign or strange was viewed with suspicion that could quickly turn to fear or violence. The Green children were installed in a small room in the manor house, where they huddled together on a straw pallet and refused to be separated even for a moment. Sir Richard's household tried every kind of food they could think of over the following days, but the children would only eat beans and occasionally some raw peas or other green vegetables. They grew thinner and weaker on this limited diet, and the boy especially seemed to fade with each passing day, as if the bright English sun was draining the life from him. The village priest Father Benedict came to examine them, and after observing them for an hour, he declared that they were not possessed by demons, but were perhaps victims of some fairy enchantment or curse. He recommended baptism as soon as the children could be taught enough Christian doctrine to understand the sacrament, though how they would learn anything when no one could speak their language remained an unsolved problem. The boy died on a cold morning in early spring, less than a year after the children had appeared in Woolpit. He had grown steadily weaker through the winter months, refusing most food and spending his days staring out the narrow window toward the forest as if hoping to see something that never appeared. The girls stayed by his side constantly, speaking to him in their language and holding his hand, and when he finally stopped breathing, she screamed with a grief that needed no translation. Father Benedict said the funeral rites over the boy's body, though he could not say whether the child's soul would find rest without proper baptism. They buried him in the churchyard at St. Mary's, and the girl stood at the graveside with tears streaming down her still green face, while the villagers who had gathered watched in uncomfortable silence. After her brother's death, something changed in the girl that no one could quite explain. She began to eat other foods beyond beans, starting with bread soaked in milk and then moving gradually to meat and cheese and all the normal fare of an English household. As her diet expanded, her green color began to fade, almost imperceptibly at first, like a plant kept too long in shadow that slowly returns to normal when brought into the light. Within 6 months, her skin had lost most of its emerald tint, and by the end of her second year in Woolpit, she looked almost like any other English girl except for a certain pallor that never quite disappeared. Sir Richard's wife, Lady Eleanor, had taken an interest in the strange child, and she arranged for the girl to be taught English by the manor's chaplain, who had some experience with languages from his time studying in Paris. The girl proved to be a quick learner once she began to apply herself to the task, and within a year she could speak simple English, though her accent remained thick and strange. She was given the Christian name Agnes after the blacksmith's wife who had first fed her, and she was baptized in the Church of St. Mary on the Feast of the Assumption in the year 1152 or 1153. The villagers who had initially feared her as something demonic or fairy-born gradually came to accept her as simply an orphan with a strange past that would probably never be fully explained. She worked in Lady Eleanor's household, learning to spin wool and help in the kitchen, and she attended Mass every Sunday with the other servants, though she sometimes seemed distracted during the services as if listening for sounds that no one else could hear. The medieval mind did not separate the natural and supernatural worlds as sharply as we do today, and the people of Woolpit had room in their understanding for things that defied easy explanation. They lived in a world where saints performed miracles and demons tempted the faithful, where the forest beyond the village held both real wolves and perhaps other things less easily named. Agnes, the green girl, was strange, yes, but she had been baptized and she worked hard and she caused no trouble. Father Benedict preached a sermon about how God sometimes sent mysteries to test the faith of believers, and most of the village seemed satisfied with this explanation, even if they whispered among themselves about where the girl had really come from. The children who had been Agnes's age when she arrived grew up alongside her, and to them she became simply Agnes from the manor house, who had once been green but now was not. It was perhaps 3 years after her arrival, when Agnes's English had become fluent enough to tell complex stories, that she finally spoke of where she and her brother had come from. Lady Eleanor asked her one evening in the solar, while they worked on embroidery by candlelight, and Agnes set down her needle and looked into the flames as if seeing something there that no one else could perceive. She said that she and her brother had lived in a land called the country of St. Martin, where the sun never shone brightly and everything existed in a kind of perpetual twilight that was neither day nor night. All the people in that land had green skin like hers had been, and they dressed in the strange clothes she had worn when she arrived, and they spoke the language she had used before learning English. Agnes said that she and her brother had been tending their father's flocks in the fields near their home when they heard the most beautiful sound they had ever encountered. It was bells ringing, but not like any bells they knew, sweeter and clearer and seeming to come from very far away. They followed the sound across the twilight fields and into a place they had been warned never to go, a rocky area where caves opened into darkness and strange echoes came up from below. The bells seemed to be coming from inside one of the caves, and they entered it without thinking of the danger while the sound drew them deeper and deeper into the earth. They walked for what felt like hours through tunnels that twisted and turned, and the bells always stayed just ahead of them, growing louder and more insistent. Then suddenly, they emerged into blinding light that hurt their eyes, and they found themselves near the wolf pits at Woolpit with no idea how they had gotten there or how to return home. Lady Eleanor asked if Agnes could describe her homeland more clearly, and the girl struggled to find words in English for things that had no equivalent in her experience of Suffolk. She said the land of St. Martin was separated from the bright country by a great river that she could sometimes see from high places in her homeland, though no one ever crossed it. She said her people farmed and kept animals much like the English did, but everything grew in the dim light without needing the fierce sun that blazed over Woolpit. When asked if she could find the cave again and return to her home, Agnes shook her head sadly and said she and her brother had searched for it many times in those first weeks, but they could never locate the entrance they had come through. It was as if the passage had closed behind them. Or perhaps they had traveled so far through the winding tunnels that they had emerged in a completely different part of the world. The story spread through the manor house and then through the village, and people debated what it might mean. Some said that Agnes had described the fairy realm known in old stories, where time moved differently and the rules of the mortal world did not apply. Others suggested she had come from inside the earth itself, where the old legends said there were vast kingdoms lit by strange fires or glowing stones. Father Benedict was troubled by the tale and consulted his books, eventually declaring that Agnes might have come from purgatory or some other intermediate realm between heaven and hell. But he also admitted that the Church had no definite teaching on whether such places could have physical entrances in the mortal world. Medieval Christianity coexisted with much older beliefs about the other world, a realm that existed alongside the human world, but separated by veils that could sometimes be crossed. The Celtic peoples who had once inhabited Britain believed in the city, or fairy folk who lived in hollow hills and could steal away human children, leaving changelings in their place. Some legends spoke of entire kingdoms beneath the ground where time moved at different speeds, and travelers who spent a single night there might return to find that 100 years had passed. The color green was associated with fairy folk in many traditions, and the prohibition against eating fairy food was well known, though Agnes's insistence on beans seemed to invert this usual pattern. Whether the people of Woolpit believed Agnes had literally come from such a place, or whether they simply lacked any better explanation for her green skin and strange language remained a question that each person answered differently. The story of the Green Children might have remained a local legend known only in Woolpit and the surrounding villages, except that two men of learning heard about it and decided it was important enough to record in writing. The first was William of Newburgh, an Augustinian canon who wrote his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, or History of English Affairs, around the year 1190. William was known as a careful and skeptical historian who frequently criticized other chroniclers for including impossible stories and obvious fabrications in their work. He despised Geoffrey of Monmouth's popular Historia Regum Britanniae, calling it full of lies and fantasies, so it was significant that William chose to include the account of the Green Children in his own supposedly factual history. William wrote that the story came to him from reliable sources who had spoken to people in Woolpit, and he emphasized that he was reporting what had been witnessed by many people rather than relying on a single dubious source. He described the children's green color and strange clothing, their refusal of normal food except beans, and the boy's death within a year. He recorded that the girl learned English and was baptized, and he included her account of the land of St. Martin, where twilight was perpetual and a great luminous river could be seen in the distance. William expressed puzzlement about how to interpret the story, admitting that he could not explain it rationally, but also could not dismiss it given the number of witnesses. He concluded that it was one of those mysteries that demonstrated the limitations of human understanding, and he left it to his readers to form their own judgments. The second chronicler was Ralph of Coggeshall, an abbot of a Cistercian monastery in Essex, who wrote his Chronicon Anglicanum, or English Chronicle, around the same period as William. Ralph's account was remarkably similar to William's, though he included some additional details and claimed to have spoken to people who had actually seen the children themselves. Ralph mentioned that the girl had been taken into service at the household of a knight, which matched the tradition about Sir Richard de Calne's family. He also provided more specifics about how the children had followed the sound of bells into a cave, and about their initial terror when they emerged into the bright world of Suffolk. Ralph seemed less skeptical than William, accepting the story more readily as an example of God's mysterious workings in the world. The fact that two independent chroniclers recorded such similar versions of the story within a few decades of when it supposedly happened gives the account of the Green Children an unusual degree of credibility for a medieval legend. Both William and Ralph were educated men who took their responsibilities as historians seriously, and both had access to sources close to the events. They were not recording ancient folklore or third-hand rumors, but a story that was still within living memory when they wrote. Medieval chronicles were the primary way that historical events were preserved, and chroniclers generally included events they believed were significant enough to be remembered. The inclusion of the Green Children in two respected chronicles suggests that the story was taken seriously by contemporaries, whether they interpreted it as a supernatural event or simply as something very strange that defied easy explanation. Agnes lived at the manor house in Woolpit for several more years after she told her story, working as a servant and becoming gradually more integrated into the normal life of medieval Suffolk. According to some later traditions, she eventually married a man from the nearby town of King's Lynn, though the details are vague and may have been embellished over time. Other accounts suggest she remained in service to the de Calne family, eventually becoming a trusted member of the household who managed the other servants and kept the accounts. What is certain is that her green color never returned once it had faded, and that she lived as an ordinary Englishwoman for the rest of her life despite her extraordinary origins. The villagers who had known her as a child would sometimes point her out to visitors or travelers, saying, "There goes Agnes, who came from the green country." But as the years passed and new generations grew up, the story became less immediate and more legendary. By the time William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall were writing their chronicles, Agnes herself may have still been alive, though probably elderly, but the events had already taken on the quality of a tale that was told and retold with slight variations. Some people claimed to remember exactly what she had looked like when she first arrived, while others admitted they had only heard about it from their parents or grandparents. There is no record of when Agnes died or where she was buried, and no grave marker has ever been found that might identify her final resting place. Perhaps she was laid to rest next to her brother in the churchyard at St. Mary's in Woolpit, or perhaps she died elsewhere, and her connection to the mysterious Green Children was forgotten by those who buried her. The last certain mention of her comes from Ralph of Coggeshall's chronicle, where he notes that she was still living in the household of a knight at the time he wrote. After that, she disappears from history as completely as she had appeared from the wolf pits all those years before, leaving behind only her impossible story and the testimony of chroniclers who believed it worth preserving. The story became part of the local folklore of Woolpit, told on long winter evenings and embellished with each retelling. Parents warned their children not to follow strange sounds into caves, and travelers who passed through the village would ask to be shown the wolf pits where the Green Children had emerged. Over the centuries, the tale was interpreted in different ways, reflecting the beliefs and concerns of each era, but it never disappeared entirely from the collective memory of Suffolk. The Green Children of Woolpit had become immortal through story, even though the real children behind the legend lived and died, like all mortals, leaving nothing behind but questions that would echo through 800 years. In the year 1845, a young Irish girl named Mary Sullivan was brought to a hospital in Cork with skin that had taken on a distinctly greenish tint, and the doctors who examined her discovered she was suffering from severe malnutrition, combined with a condition they called chlorosis or green sickness. The lack of proper food had caused her blood to lose its healthy red color, and the resulting anemia made her skin appear pale with an almost greenish cast particularly visible in natural light. When Mary was given proper nutrition, including iron-rich foods, her color gradually returned to normal over the course of several months, much like what was described happening to Agnes of Woolpit. Modern medical understanding has identified hypochromic anemia as a condition where insufficient iron in the diet leads to poorly formed red blood cells. And in extreme cases, this can cause the skin to take on colors ranging from pale yellow to greenish, especially in individuals who already have fair complexions. Could the green children of Woolpit have been suffering from severe malnutrition that gave their skin an unusual color, which medieval observers without modern medical knowledge interpreted as genuinely green? If they were refugee children who had been lost or hiding in the forest for weeks, eating only whatever plants they could find, they might have developed anemia severe enough to discolor their skin. Their insistence on eating only beans might have been because beans were the only food they recognized from their previous diet, or because their damaged digestive systems could not initially process other foods. The boy's death within a year could be explained by his anemia being more severe than his sister's, or by his inability to adapt to the new diet quickly enough to recover. Another medical possibility involves arsenic poisoning, which was not uncommon in medieval England, where arsenic could be present in certain water sources or in food contaminated by specific types of fungi. A case from 19th century Germany documented a family whose skin took on a greenish-gray tone after drinking water from a well contaminated with copper and arsenic compounds, and the children in particular showed the most dramatic discoloration. Medieval mining operations sometimes released arsenic into groundwater, and if the green children came from an area near old Roman or Saxon mining works, they might have been slowly poisoned over time. However, this theory struggles to explain why their color would persist so long after leaving the contaminated environment, or why the girl's color faded gradually, rather than disappearing once she stopped consuming the poison. The medical explanation is appealing in its rationality and its reliance on documented conditions that can cause unusual skin coloration. But it requires us to assume that two medieval chroniclers and dozens of witnesses were either exaggerating a subtle greenish tint, or that the children's malnutrition was so severe it produced a color vivid enough to be remarkable. It also does not explain the children's incomprehensible language or their strange clothing, which would require additional explanations beyond the medical condition. The year 1173 saw one of the bloodiest episodes in East Anglian history when the forces of Henry II crushed a rebellion that had been supported by Flemish mercenaries fighting for the rebel lords. The Battle of Fornham near Bury St. Edmunds was a massacre, and in its aftermath, the surviving Flemish soldiers and the civilians who had followed them were hunted through the forests and fields of Suffolk. A Flemish woman named Margarete, who had come to England with her merchant husband, left a brief account preserved in a monastery chronicle, describing how families fled into the great forest of Thetford, trying to escape English soldiers who were killing anyone who spoke the Flemish language. Marguerite wrote about seeing children separated from their parents in the chaos, wandering alone in the deep woods, where the sunlight barely penetrated through the thick canopy of oak and ash and elm. She described how some Flemish families had been living in makeshift camps in the forest for weeks or months, surviving on foraged food and whatever they could carry. The children born or raised in these desperate circumstances might have developed the pallor of people who lived under the forest canopy, and combined with malnutrition, this could have given them the greenish tint that shocked the people of Woolpit. The Flemish language would have been completely incomprehensible to Suffolk villagers who spoke Middle English, and Flemish clothing styles were different enough to seem foreign and strange. The timing of the Green Children's appearance in Woolpit, sometime around 1150 to 1160, according to most estimates, falls in a period of ongoing tension between English communities and Flemish immigrants who had come to East Anglia to work in the growing wool trade. There had been riots against Flemish weavers in several towns, and Flemish families living in rural areas were sometimes attacked or driven out of their settlements. If the Green Children were the son and daughter of a Flemish family trying to escape persecution, they might have been living in the forest near Woolpit for some time before they were discovered. The Great Forest of Thetford was only a few miles from Woolpit, and its depths were so dark and tangled that medieval people sometimes called it the place where day becomes night. Agnes's description of the land of St. Martin, where everything was in twilight, could have been a child's memory of living under the forest canopy where sunlight was filtered and dim. The bells she claimed to have followed might have been the actual bells of Woolpit Church, which would have rung the canonical hours throughout the day and could have been heard some distance into the forest. The underground tunnels she described could have been a child's confused memory of following paths through dense undergrowth or through ravines and gullies that felt like being underground. When she spoke of her homeland being separated by a great river, she might have been remembering the Low Countries of Flanders, where water and rivers dominate the landscape in ways very different from Suffolk. This theory has the advantage of explaining almost every strange element of the story through natural means, while accounting for why two educated chroniclers would record it as fact rather than dismissing it as fantasy. Flemish refugee children would have seemed foreign and bizarre to isolated English villagers, and the tragedy of their situation might have been incomprehensible enough to be interpreted as supernatural. However, the Flemish theory requires us to believe that no one in Woolpit or at Sir Richard's Manor recognized Flemish as a language, despite the significant Flemish presence in East Anglia at the time. It also does not fully explain why chroniclers would describe this as a unique mystery rather than simply identifying them as Flemish orphans. Suffolk in the 12th century was dotted with ancient mine works left by the Romans and Saxons, who had dug for iron and other metals in various locations, including areas not far from Woolpit. A survey of medieval Suffolk conducted in the 19th century documented several sites where old mining tunnels had collapsed or been abandoned, creating dangerous cave systems that locals avoided. In 1862, a farmer near Bury St. Edmunds discovered a family of squatters living in an abandoned Roman mine shaft where they had been hiding from debt collectors for more than 3 months. When the family emerged into daylight, their skin had a pale, almost gray-green cast from lack of sun exposure, and the children in particular looked sickly and strange after so long underground. If the Green Children of Woolpit had been living in a cave or mine shaft, perhaps with a family member who then died leaving them alone, they would have developed the extreme pallor associated with absence of sunlight. Medieval people living underground would have had limited food options, and if they were surviving on stored beans or other preserved vegetables, their diet would have matched what Agnes insisted on eating. The tunnels of an old mine work could wind for considerable distances underground, and children following them might emerge far from where they entered, explaining why Agnes could not find her way back. The twilight she described could be the dim light in the upper levels of a cave system where some daylight filtered in, but never the full brightness of the sun. However, this theory faces challenges in explaining why children would be living underground in the first place, and why their language would be incomprehensible if they were from Suffolk or nearby regions. It also requires a cave system near Woolpit that has never been documented or discovered, though it is possible such a system existed and has since collapsed or been filled in. The cave theory works best when combined with another explanation, such as the Flemish refugee theory, where the children might have been living in caves while their family hid from persecution. In the year 1133, a mass panic swept through parts of France and Germany when people became convinced that dancing mania had been caused by demonic possession, and thousands of people reported seeing victims dance uncontrollably until they collapsed. Modern historians recognize this as a case of mass hysteria, where social stress and religious fervor combined to create shared delusions that entire communities believed were real. Medieval society was prone to such episodes, particularly in rural areas where life was hard and education limited, and supernatural explanations were readily accepted for anything unusual. Could the story of the Green Children be a product of mass hysteria or collective embellishment, where perhaps two ordinary lost children were encountered and their strangeness was exaggerated by frightened villagers? In this interpretation, the children might have had some unusual features, perhaps a slight skin discoloration from illness and foreign-sounding speech from a regional dialect. But the community's interpretation of these features became increasingly supernatural as the story was told and retold. By the time chroniclers arrived to record the tale decades later, the original truth had been buried under layers of folk interpretation and religious symbolism. The problem with this theory is that it must explain why educated men like William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall took the story seriously enough to record it, when both were known for their skepticism toward obviously fantastic tales. It also struggles with the specific details that both chroniclers report, such as the children's refusal of normal food and the girl's detailed description of her homeland. Mass hysteria typically produces vague stories that shift with each retelling, whereas the Green Children story remains remarkably consistent across different sources. Unless we assume that the chroniclers themselves were deceived or that they deliberately recorded fiction as fact, the mass hysteria explanation seems insufficient to account for all the evidence. The Celtic peoples who inhabited Britain before the Romans had rich traditions about the otherworld, a realm that existed parallel to our own and could sometimes be accessed through caves or hollow hills or bodies of water. In these traditions, the fairy folk or Sita were often described as having unusual appearances, and green was a color strongly associated with them in Irish and Welsh mythology. Stories of humans stumbling into the otherworld and then returning to find that time had passed differently, or that they could no longer find their way back, were common throughout medieval folklore. A story recorded in Wales in the 13th century tells of a boy who followed his animals into a cave and emerged in a beautiful underground kingdom where small people with fair skin lived in perpetual twilight. And when he tried to bring back gold from this place, the entrance vanished and he could never return. This story is remarkably similar to Agnes's account of the land of St. Martin, suggesting that both might be drawing on common folkloric themes rather than describing real events. Some scholars have suggested that the Green Children story was actually an old folktale that became attached to the village of Woolpit, and that William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall were recording what they thought was a recent event, but was actually a legend. However, this theory must explain why the story includes such specific details, like the village name of Woolpit and the possible identification of Sir Richard de Calne as the local lord, and why it appears suddenly in 12th century chronicles rather than being found in earlier sources. It also does not account for the consistency of details between the two independent chroniclers, which suggests they were reporting a story that was being told in a specific way rather than recording different versions of a wandering folktale. The folkloric theory is most convincing when used to explain how medieval people interpreted the events rather than suggesting the events never happened at all. England in the 12th century was a land of dramatic transformation and frequent violence, where the Norman conquest was still within living memory, and society was struggling to integrate different cultures and languages. Henry II, who ruled from 1154 to 1189, was attempting to impose royal authority over a fractious nobility, and his reign saw rebellions and conflicts that touched every part of the kingdom, including quiet Suffolk. The wool trade was beginning to transform East Anglia into one of the wealthiest regions of England, and Flemish immigrants were arriving in significant numbers to work in the textile industry, creating tensions with English workers and craftsmen. Woolpit itself was a prosperous village by medieval standards, with rich agricultural land and a position on important roads connecting Bury St. Edmunds to other market towns. The village church of St. Mary was substantial enough to suggest a community with resources, and the presence of a manor house meant there was local lordship, providing both protection and control. The villagers would have been primarily engaged in farming, with most families working land they held from the lord in exchange for labor services and a portion of their harvest. Life expectancy was short by modern standards, with perhaps half of all children dying before reaching adulthood, and disease and famine were constant threats that could devastate a community in a matter of weeks. The medieval worldview did not separate natural and supernatural realms the way modern thinking does, and educated people accepted that miracles and wonders were possible within God's creation. The church taught that demons and angels could intervene in human affairs, and that the devil was constantly working to corrupt souls and spread confusion. At the same time, there were older beliefs that persisted beneath the surface of Christian doctrine, ideas about fairy folk and nature spirits, and enchanted places that the church officially condemned but could never fully suppress. When something inexplicable happened, like the appearance of green children speaking an unknown language, people had multiple frameworks for trying to understand it. The fact that William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall both chose to record the story of the green children tells us something important about what kinds of events were considered historically significant in the 12th century. Chronicles were not simply records of political events and royal successions, but were also attempts to document the full range of human experience, including the strange and miraculous. Both chroniclers saw themselves as preserving knowledge for future generations, and they included stories like the Green Children because they believed these events revealed something important about the nature of the world and God's plans. Williams specifically noted that he included the story despite his own skepticism because the number of witnesses and the reliability of his sources made it impossible to dismiss. The role of children in medieval society was different from modern conceptions in ways that are important for understanding the Green Children's story. Children were expected to work from an early age, and by 7 or 8 years old, most were performing useful labor in fields or workshops or households. Orphans and foundlings were not uncommon in a society where disease and violence frequently killed parents, and communities had informal systems for absorbing these children into households where they could work in exchange for food and shelter. Agnes's integration into Sir Richard's household as a servant would have been a normal fate for an orphan girl, and the fact that she was green and foreign would have been seen as merely making her story more interesting rather than making her fundamentally different from other orphans. The treatment of foreigners and outsiders in medieval England was complex and often contradictory, with hospitality toward travelers being a Christian duty, while suspicion of strangers was also deeply ingrained. Villages like Woolpit were tightly knit communities where everyone knew everyone else, and the arrival of strangers could be both exciting and threatening. The Green children's initial reception seems to have been marked by fear and curiosity in roughly equal measure, with the villagers keeping them at a distance while also ensuring they were fed and housed. Sir Richard's decision to take responsibility for the children, rather than driving them away or treating them as demonic, suggests a relatively enlightened attitude, though one still shaped by medieval assumptions about authority and social hierarchy. The landscape of Suffolk in this period was very different from today, with much more forest cover and large areas of marsh and heath that were considered dangerous and difficult to traverse. The great forest of Thetford stretched for miles, and within its depths, there were places where people could hide or become lost for weeks. Wolves were still present in significant numbers, hence the wolf pits that gave Woolpit its name, and the forest was associated in popular imagination with outlaws and hermits and possibly worse things. When Agnes described emerging from darkness into light, medieval listeners would have understood this through their own experience of forests as liminal spaces between the known world of the village and the unknown world of the wilderness. The question of language is particularly intriguing because 12th century England was already a multilingual society where Norman French and English and Latin all coexisted, and educated people would have been familiar with the idea that different regions spoke different tongues. For the Green children's language to be described as completely incomprehensible, it must have been something truly foreign, not simply a dialect or regional variation. This supports theories that connect them to Flemish refugees or possibly to an even more distant origin, though it also raises the question of why no one in Woolpit or at Sir Richard's court recognized the language if it was indeed Flemish. The mystery of their speech is in some ways as profound as the mystery of their green skin, and any complete explanation must account for both. Agnes lay in her bed in a small house in Lynn many decades after she had first emerged from the forest near Woolpit, and she was very old now, with grandchildren who came to visit and called her grandmother, though they laughed when people said she had once been green. The room was dim because her eyes had grown sensitive to bright light in her old age, and sometimes when the shadows gathered in the corners, she thought she could almost see the perpetual twilight of her childhood. Her husband had died 3 years before, a good man who had never asked too many questions about where she really came from, and her children were grown and living their own lives as fishermen and merchants and craftsmen's wives. She thought often in these last days about her brother, whose name in their language she had not spoken aloud in more than 50 years, because there was no one left who would understand it. She remembered how he had held her hand in the darkness of the tunnels while they followed the sound of bells, and how he had cried when they first saw the terrible brightness of the English sun, and how he had refused to eat even when they brought him the beans he asked for because something inside him had already given up. She had survived by forgetting, by learning to be English and Christian and normal, but he had remembered too much, and the memory had killed him. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep, Agnes would hear the bells again, not the church bells of Lynn or Woolpit, but those other bells that had drawn her and her brother away from everything they knew. In her dreams, she walked through the twilight fields of St. Martin, where everything was green and soft, and the harsh brightness of the sun never burned her eyes, and her brother was there waiting for her, just as she had waited for him beside that grave in Woolpit so long ago. But then she would wake to find herself in England still, in this world of painful light and incomprehensible customs, and a language that had become more natural to her than the tongue of her birth. She wondered if her children would tell the story of the green girl to their children, or if it would fade into nothing more than a strange tale that might or might not be true. She wondered if anyone would believe that she had really come from somewhere else, from a land of twilight and green people and bells that called across impossible distances. Or would they decide she had been a Flemish child, or a sick child, or a lost child, whose imagination had created a fantasy to explain a trauma too terrible to remember clearly? Perhaps it did not matter what they believed as long as some memory of her and her brother persisted, two children who had been lost and lost again in different ways. The green had faded from her skin so long ago that she could barely remember what it felt like to look at her hands and see that emerald color. But sometimes she imagined she could still see traces of it, like a stain that went deeper than the surface and could never be entirely washed away. She had lived a full life by any measure, working and marrying and raising children, and even finding moments of happiness in this bright, strange world. But part of her had never left that twilight country where she had been born. Part of her was still following those bells through the darkness, still hoping to find her way home, even though home no longer existed, if it ever had. We will never know the truth about the green children of Woolpit, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Every explanation, from medical conditions to refugee children to folkloric invention, has some merit, and each one fails to account for some aspect of the story that refuses to fit neatly into our rational frameworks. What we do know is that in the 12th century, something happened in Suffolk that was strange enough and memorable enough to be recorded by two independent chroniclers, and that this story has survived 800 years because it touches something deep in the human imagination. The green children remind us that the past is truly foreign, that medieval people lived in a world where the boundaries between natural and supernatural were porous, and where mystery was not something to be solved, but something to be lived with. They show us how communities respond to the inexplicable, with fear and curiosity, and eventually with acceptance that some questions may never be answered. Whether Agnes and her brother really came from an underground kingdom of twilight, or whether they were simply two lost children whose tragic story became legendary, they have achieved a kind of immortality that few people attain. The story endures because it captures something essential about the human condition, our longing for worlds beyond our own, our fear of the different and unknown, our capacity for both cruelty and kindness toward those who do not fit our expectations. In the end, perhaps what matters most is not whether the children were actually green, but that people believed they were, and that this belief led them to treat these orphans with enough care that one of them survived to tell her story. The bells that Agnes followed may have been real church bells or fairy music, or the sound of her own longing for something she could not name, but they led her to a life she would never have chosen and could never fully escape. And in that sense, her story is not so different from all our stories. We are all following sounds we only half understand toward destinations we can barely imagine.